A ruthless millionaire hired a poor nanny for his son, but her past left him stunned. The towering mansion stood like a fortress of cold stone, exuding wealth yet eerily devoid of life. It belonged to Sebastian Cole, a billionaire whose sharp mind and unrelenting ambition had built an empire from the ground up. Yet, beneath his success lay a man hollowed by his own choices, the glimmer of humanity dulled by years of single-minded focus on power and control. The grandeur of his home reflected his isolation. Rooms filled with priceless art and furniture that no one sat on, corridors echoing with silence, and a chill that no fire could chase away. He lived alone with his young son, Lucas, a boy whose presence served as a constant reminder of the wife Sebastian had lost. Though the world viewed him as untouchable, Sebastian was a man haunted by grief he refused to face, burying it under an avalanche of work and a facade of indifference. Lucas, on the other hand, was a tempest in a fragile frame, his small world shaped by the absence of his mother and the emotional neglect of his father. He yearned for affection, for someone to notice the boy behind the tantrums and tears. His cries for attention came as loud outbursts, sharp defiance, and an unruly energy that no one seemed able to contain. A revolving door of nannies had tried to manage him, each leaving defeated, unable to break through his walls or soothe his pain. To Sebastian, Lucas's behavior was a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed. It was another item on his to-do list, a puzzle that frustrated him because it didn't respond to the logical strategies that had made him so successful in every other area of his life. And then came Emma Harper. She arrived at the mansion on a gray afternoon, her demeanor as unassuming as the small car she parked outside the gates. Her clothes were plain but neat, her voice gentle yet firm as she introduced herself. Emma was a woman of quiet strength, her eyes holding a warmth that seemed almost out of place in the mansion's cold, hollow halls. Lucas, who had made a game of scaring off every other nanny, surprised everyone by not retreating from her. Instead, he stayed close, watching her with cautious curiosity. It was as though in Emma he sensed something familiar, something safe. Sebastian stood to the side, arms crossed, observing the interaction with a detached skepticism. He didn't trust this woman who seemed so soft-spoken and unguarded. Surely she wouldn't last. Yet, Lucas's uncharacteristic calmness was undeniable. It was enough to make him pause, to consider whether hiring her might solve one of the many problems on his plate. When Emma addressed him, there was no trace of intimidation in her voice, despite his cold demeanor. She spoke with a quiet confidence, answering his questions directly and without pretense. It wasn't what he had expected, and for a moment, something about her reminded him of a time before loss had hardened him. When the decision was made, it was Lucas who tipped the scales. His rare acceptance of Emma made it impossible for Sebastian to ignore. Still, he made his terms clear. Results were all that mattered. Emma wasn't here to bond with them or change the household. She was here to handle Lucas, to fix what was broken. There was no room for sentiment or failure. Emma accepted the position with a nod, her calm composure unwavering even under the weight of his pointed words. As she moved into her new role, Emma's warm presence began to contrast starkly with the cold environment of the mansion. Yet, there was something guarded about her, a flicker of pain that occasionally surfaced in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. She deflected personal questions with practiced ease, keeping her past shrouded in mystery. Even so, her actions spoke louder than her words. Where others had failed to connect with Lucas, Emma began to find small ways to reach him. Emma's arrival marked the beginning of subtle but significant shifts within the mansion. Though the halls remained cold and the air heavy with unspoken grief, her presence brought an almost imperceptible warmth. She approached Lucas with a patience and understanding that no one before her had shown. Rather than reprimanding his outbursts, she listened. Rather than trying to control him, she sought to understand him. Through gentle storytelling and playful activities, she created moments where Lucas could lower his defenses. Slowly, the boy who had been so full of anger began to show glimmers of the child he might have been before tragedy struck. He started to laugh at her silly jokes, to sit still as she read to him, and even to trust her enough to hold her hand during moments of uncertainty. Sebastian, meanwhile, observed all of this with a mix of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. He couldn't deny the changes he saw in Lucas, but he questioned Emma's methods. Her approach seemed soft, too idealistic for the hard realities of his world. He watched her closely, scrutinizing her interactions with his son, and yet he found himself drawn to the way she handled Lucas's fragile emotions with such care. It was a skill he lacked entirely, one that unsettled him because it exposed the gaping void in his own ability to connect. Despite his critical eye, Sebastian couldn't help but notice how Lucas's tantrums had started to subside and how the boy's laughter, once absent from the mansion, now echoed faintly through its halls. For Emma, however, the task was not without its challenges. Navigating the mansion's emotionally charged atmosphere required resilience. Sebastian's cold demeanor and tendency to treat her as an employee rather than an individual were constant reminders of the power dynamic between them. But she didn't let his aloofness deter her. Instead, she focused on her bond with Lucas, pouring her energy into building a safe space for the boy who so clearly needed it. Yet, even as she succeeded in her role as Lucas's nanny, her own carefully guarded walls remained firmly in place. She avoided questions about her past with a practiced smile, deflecting curiosity with answers that revealed little. There were moments when shadows crossed her face, a flicker of pain that spoke of memories too heavy to share. One day, as Lucas explored the house with his newfound sense of security, he stumbled upon a small, worn photograph tucked away in Emma's belongings. The image showed a younger Emma holding a baby, her smile bright, but her eyes carrying a hint of sadness. When Lucas asked her about the picture, Emma froze for a moment, visibly shaken. She quickly tucked the photograph away, her warm demeanor replaced by a sudden, quiet tension. "It's someone very special," she whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. Lucas didn't press further, sensing the weight of her words, but the moment left a lingering question in the air. Sebastian, who had witnessed the exchange from a distance, found his curiosity piqued. For all her warmth and composure, Emma clearly carried a burden she kept hidden. He dismissed the thought at first, telling himself it was none of his concern, but the image of her stricken expression stayed with him. It was the first time he'd seen her mask slip, revealing a vulnerability that mirrored the one he worked so hard to conceal within himself. As the days passed, Emma settled further into her role, and Lucas continued to flourish under her care. Yet beneath the surface, tension lingered. The mystery surrounding Emma hinted at a deeper story, one that remained untold. Sebastian, despite his initial dismissal of her, found himself observing her more closely, noticing the way her presence had begun to transform not just Lucas, but the mansion itself. The walls no longer seemed so cold, the silence not so heavy. And though he would never admit it aloud, Sebastian found himself questioning whether Emma's arrival might also be the key to confronting the ghosts of his own past. The stage was set for the tangled web of their lives to unravel, each of them unaware of just how deeply their stories would intertwine. Emma's guarded secrets, Sebastian's buried grief, and Lucas's longing for a family. All were threads waiting to be pulled, promising a journey of heartbreak, redemption, and perhaps the possibility of healing. Emma entered her role in the mansion with an air of quiet determination, eager to make a difference in Lucas's life. She didn't approach the boy with the same sharp, no-nonsense attitude that had failed so many others before her. Instead, she listened, observed, and gently tried to understand the source of his anger and pain. Her methods were subtle. Stories told during quiet afternoons, shared moments of drawing, and imaginary adventures that allowed Lucas to explore his emotions in ways he couldn't articulate. Every small act of kindness, every moment she spent simply being present, began to chip away at the emotional walls Lucas had built around himself. Where there had once been constant outbursts and defiance, there was now a cautious calmness. For the first time in a long while, Lucas seemed to feel seen, not just as a problem to be fixed, but as a person worthy of attention and love. The once impossible task of connecting with him had become, For Emma, a series of small victories. He laughed more. He shared snippets of his day without being prompted. For all the pain that had once kept him closed off, there was now a new openness, a willingness to trust. The change in Lucas didn't go unnoticed, though Sebastian's response was far from enthusiastic. He observed Emma's efforts from a distance, his critical eye scanning every interaction, every approach she used. To him, her method seemed overly idealistic, soft, impractical solutions to what he saw as a complex, deeply ingrained problem. Emma was simply doing what she was hired for, nothing more. He saw no reason to acknowledge any deeper impact she might be having on his son. Despite his skepticism, Sebastian couldn't deny the undeniable shifts in Lucas. There were moments, however brief, where the boy seemed genuinely happy, a joy that had been absent for far too long. Lucas was calmer, more expressive. Sebastian felt the faintest stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But he buried it quickly, not allowing himself to entertain the thought that Emma's influence might be the catalyst. He refused to admit that anything outside of his own control could be the key to changing his family's trajectory. It wasn't long before the emotional distance between Sebastian and Emma began to show cracks. One evening, during an impromptu conversation about Lucas's behavior, Emma offered an observation. Her voice was soft but direct, as she suggested that Sebastian's detachment from his son might be a significant part of the problem. "He needs you," Emma said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "More than you know." Sebastian's immediate response was defensive, his jaw tightening as if the very suggestion was an attack on his character. "I know how to raise my son," he retorted, his tone sharp, but beneath the surface, there was a flicker of something, an insecurity, perhaps, or a recognition that she might be right. He quickly dismissed her words, his pride refusing to let him admit any flaw in his approach. But Emma's gentle confrontation stayed with him. The possibility that he had failed Lucas in ways he couldn't comprehend lingered, gnawing at him even as he rejected it. The tension between them grew in subtle ways after that. Emma, though accustomed to managing difficult situations, felt the weight of their growing emotional divide. She remained focused on her role, but her own inner turmoil began to show through in fleeting moments. One day, while Lucas was playing in her quarters, he found a photograph tucked away in a drawer. It was an image of a younger Emma holding a baby, her expression tender, though her eyes were shadowed with sadness. Lucas, innocent as ever, asked about the child in the photo. Emma's reaction was immediate, a flash of distress that caused her to quickly hide the picture away. She offered a vague answer, but it was clear that the photograph held some deeper significance, a piece of her past she wasn't ready to share. Lucas didn't press the issue, but the moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. Emma's discomfort was palpable, and for the first time, Lucas sensed there was more to her than the warm, calm exterior she had shown him. Sebastian had witnessed the interaction from a distance, and though he didn't understand the significance of the photograph, something in Emma's reaction stirred his curiosity. There was a history there, something Emma had been hiding. He couldn't help but wonder what had caused her to react with such urgency. He had always been a man of control. Nothing left to chance, no loose ends. Yet with Emma, things were different. She was an enigma. A part of him was drawn to her kindness, the way she seemed to give so freely, but another part of him couldn't ignore the subtle signals that there was something broken behind her eyes. He felt himself at a crossroads. His curiosity about her past intensified, but his natural inclination to maintain control over every aspect of his life made him hesitant to pry too deeply. One evening, when the house was quiet and Lucas had already drifted off to sleep, Sebastian found himself unexpectedly drawn to the sound of a lullaby drifting through the halls. He followed the soft melody, and to his surprise, it led him to Lucas's room, where Emma was tucking the boy into bed. Her voice was gentle and soothing, the lullaby a haunting tune that seemed to echo with the weight of forgotten memories. As he stood in the doorway, watching Emma, a flood of emotions washed over him. The lullaby stirred memories of his late wife, the way she had once sung to Lucas, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the tight grip he had on his grief slip. He hadn't allowed himself to mourn for years, burying his emotions under layers of work and stoic detachment. But now, in this quiet moment, he felt the full weight of his loss, and it left him raw. Emma's song had cracked open a part of him he thought he had long since sealed away. Sebastian's perception of Emma shifted in that moment. He had always seen her as just an employee, someone who was there to take care of his son and keep the household running smoothly. But now, as he watched her tenderly care for Lucas, he saw a depth to her, a gentleness and kindness that he hadn't recognized before. It was as if she had unknowingly entered his world and changed it in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The mansion, once a cold and sterile place, now felt slightly different. There was a warmth in the air, a subtle shift that Emma had brought with her, and it was becoming more and more apparent that her presence was affecting more than just Lucas. It was beginning to affect Sebastian, too, though he was reluctant to admit it. Sebastian couldn't quite shake the feeling that something inside the mansion had started to shift, though he resisted acknowledging it. The house, once an isolated symbol of his achievements, felt less like a fortress and more like a space he couldn't fully control. Emma's influence was subtle but undeniable, like the quiet presence of a storm on the horizon. Lucas was changing, yes, but it wasn't just Lucas who seemed to be slowly unraveling the carefully woven layers of distance Sebastian had surrounded himself with. The warmth Emma had brought into the cold, sterile halls of the mansion was now starting to permeate into every corner of his life. It was small at first, an unexpected smile from Lucas when he walked into a room, the sound of laughter echoing down the hall, the way Emma's gentle voice would occasionally cut through the harsh silence, her words always kind and patient. As the days passed, Sebastian couldn't ignore the fact that things were different. The mansion had become alive with the noise and energy that had been missing for so long, and while part of him resented that he couldn't maintain his perfect control over everything, another part of him was drawn to it. But the more he observed Emma, the more he realized she wasn't as easy to dismiss as he had once hoped. Her strength was quiet, but it was undeniably present. She wasn't just taking care of Lucas, she was changing him, and in turn, that change was forcing Sebastian to confront his own deeply buried emotions. There were moments when Emma's influence on Lucas made him question his own parenting. For years, he had kept his son at arm's length, thinking that financial stability and discipline were enough. But as he watched Emma's gentle approach, he saw what he had been missing. Lucas needed more than rules and structure. He needed emotional connection. One afternoon, when Emma was helping Lucas with a drawing, Sebastian stood in the doorway, watching them. Lucas was speaking to her softly, something he had never done with anyone other than his mother. And for the first time, Sebastian wondered if he had failed his son in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. His mind raced, his thoughts spiraling, but he couldn't bring himself to ask Emma about it. The walls he had built around himself for so long weren't easily torn down. They had been constructed out of years of loss and fear. And now, just as Emma was breaking through with Lucas, those walls were starting to crack under the weight of something he wasn't prepared to face. His curiosity about Emma deepened, and with it, a new kind of tension began to build between them. There were no more moments of light-hearted conversation or shared glances of understanding. Their interactions became more strained, a subtle tug-of-war over control. Sebastian wanted to keep things professional, but he couldn't ignore how her presence had begun to affect him. It wasn't just the way she cared for Lucas. There was something else, something about Emma's unspoken past that intrigued him. She wasn't like the other nannies. She wasn't just here to take care of his son. She was here, quietly changing the very dynamics of his family. Emma, for her part, began to feel the weight of the situation. She had never expected her role to evolve in this way, to become so intertwined with the emotional currents of the family. Her own history, once carefully buried beneath layers of composure, was now being brought to the surface in the quiet moments she shared with Sebastian and Lucas. There were days when she would catch herself lost in thought, wondering if she had made the right choice in coming here. She was still haunted by the past, by the loss of her son, and the thought of how it might affect her relationship with Lucas, or even with Sebastian, left her unsettled. Despite these fears, Emma continued to do what she did best. She kept going. She focused on Lucas, allowing him to lean on her when he needed to, while never allowing herself to fully acknowledge the toll it was taking on her. She had learned long ago to bury her own pain, to push it down and ignore it, because dealing with it meant confronting truths she wasn't ready to face. But now, as she navigated the complicated emotions of living in the mansion, the pressure of it all started to weigh on her. She knew the emotional bond she had with Lucas was growing, but she also knew that there was a limit to how much she could give without risking everything. Sebastian, ever the observer, noticed Emma's subtle withdrawal as the days went by. She wasn't as open with him anymore, and when their paths crossed, there was a quiet tension in the air, a wordless understanding that something was shifting beneath the surface. Neither of them was ready to confront it, not yet. But Sebastian felt it, felt the pull towards her, felt the question of what had brought Emma to this point, and whether he could truly allow her to become a part of his world in any deeper way. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Sebastian found himself alone in his study, staring at the same walls that had surrounded him for years. He had always been in control. His life had been dictated by logic, numbers, and a carefully curated distance from anything that might expose his vulnerabilities. But now, he felt something shifting within him, a nagging doubt, a crack in his emotional fortress. His mind wandered back to Emma, to her quiet strength and the bond she was forming with Lucas. For the first time in a long while, Sebastian felt the weight of the choices he had made, and the possibility that he could choose differently. Sebastian couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was hiding something, and it gnawed at him. Every moment of vulnerability she showed seemed carefully measured, as if she were guarding a piece of herself that was too painful to reveal. Her quiet, composed demeanor had begun to irritate him, not just because it left him in the dark, but because it threatened his carefully controlled world. She was different from the others he'd hired, far more than a mere caretaker for Lucas. And the more he observed, the more suspicious he grew. It wasn't just the way she avoided certain topics or her evasive reactions when questions turned personal. It was the look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. It was as if there were a storm inside her that she kept locked away, and the more he saw it, the more it unsettled him. It was one particular moment, however, that pushed him past his tolerance for uncertainty. Lucas, as usual, had been quietly exploring the mansion, and in the process, he discovered an old photograph of a young woman holding a baby. It was a fleeting moment, a small detail, but it was enough. Sebastian had seen Emma's reaction the second she walked in and noticed Lucas holding the picture. The tension in her face was immediate, the subtle way she tried to divert Lucas's attention to something else. It was too much of a reaction, too sharp for it to be inconsequential. She was hiding something, and now, Sebastian couldn't ignore it any longer. The following evening, after a long day of work, Sebastian decided to take action. He was a man who valued control, who thrived on knowing everything he could about the people around him. Emma's secretive nature couldn't be allowed to continue. If she was going to be part of Lucas's life, then he needed to know what he was dealing with. So, he hired a private investigator, someone who could dig into Emma's past, uncover the details she had kept hidden. It was a decision that left him conflicted, but it felt necessary. He needed to control the narrative, to know what he was really dealing with. The report came a few days later, and the information it contained struck him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emma's past was darker than he could have ever imagined. The report detailed a bitter custody battle, a fight she had lost, a loss that had torn her life apart. The custody of her son, Noah, had been taken from her years ago, with no clear explanation of what happened after that. Sebastian's stomach turned as he read through the report, the details unsettling him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the fact that she had lost custody. It was the way her ex-husband had used his wealth and influence to destroy her chances of keeping her son. There was an ache in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He had seen Emma's emotional reactions to certain moments, the guarded way she spoke about her past, but he hadn't understood the gravity of it. Now, with the details laid bare, he found himself torn. His empathy for her, the person he had slowly begun to admire, clashed violently with the anger he felt for the man who had torn her life apart. Yet his growing curiosity didn't allow him to turn away. Instead, it drove him to confront her. He couldn't let it go. That night, after a tense silence between them, he asked her about the report. The words came out sharper than he had intended, but he couldn't stop them. His voice was a mixture of accusation and concern, the distrust he felt evident in every syllable. Emma's reaction was immediate. Her face went pale, and her body stiffened as she braced herself for the confrontation. She didn't deny it, but she didn't give him the full truth either. Instead, she withdrew, her vulnerability suddenly exposed, a rawness in her voice as she tried to hold back the tears. For a moment, Sebastian almost regretted pressing her. It wasn't just the pain in her eyes that unsettled him. It was the weight of the truth she had been carrying all these years. She didn't just lose custody of her son. She had fought with every ounce of her being, and she had still lost. Her voice trembled as she spoke, recounting the painful details of her past. She explained how her ex-husband had manipulated the legal system, used his wealth and power to take everything from her. She described the emotional toll the custody battle had taken on her. How, in the end, all she could do was walk away, broken, but with the hope that one day she might find a way to reconnect with her son. The story she told was raw, filled with pain and heartache, and for the first time, Sebastian understood the depth of her loss. She was no longer just the woman who took care of his son. She was a mother who had been through a war she could never win, and the scars of that war still haunted her. As she spoke, Sebastian felt something shift inside him. He had always viewed Emma as a hired hand, someone who was simply fulfilling a role in his life, and in Lucas's life. But now, as he listened to her story, he began to see her in a new light. She was more than just an employee. She was a woman who had endured unimaginable pain, a mother who had fought for her child and lost. He saw the parallels between her grief and his own. His wife's death had been his own devastating loss, but Emma had lost something far more visceral. It was a loss that had shaped her, defined her, and now, Sebastian felt a deep sense of guilt. He had judged her without knowing the whole story, had dismissed her because he hadn't wanted to face the truth about her past. But now, as she stood before him, vulnerable and broken, he couldn't deny the depth of her pain, or the strength it had taken for her to survive it. Sebastian's perspective had shifted in ways he could not fully comprehend, and as Emma's words hung in the air, he felt a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, confusion, and sympathy collided within him. The walls he had spent years building around his heart began to crack, though he was unsure whether to embrace or resist the shift. He had always believed that emotional vulnerability was a weakness, that it left him exposed, and he had carefully constructed a life that kept those emotions at bay. But now, in the face of Emma's honesty and pain, the facade he had so diligently maintained seemed like a fragile barrier. As Emma finished her story, silence fell between them. She had confessed everything, laid bare the most painful chapter of her life, and all Sebastian could do was look at her, his mind swirling with the weight of her truth. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had expected anger, perhaps more defensiveness, but instead, there was nothing but an aching vulnerability that mirrored the grief he had carried for so long. He had believed for years that he was the only one who had truly suffered, but Emma's loss was different, more complex, more layered, and it made him question everything about the way he had approached life. Emma's breath was shallow, and her shoulders trembled slightly as she wiped away the stray tear that had escaped. She didn't look at him directly, her gaze fixed somewhere far off, as if trying to gather the pieces of herself that had been scattered by the storm of the past few moments. The strength she had shown throughout the conversation now seemed to dissipate, leaving her fragile and exposed. The wall she had so carefully built to protect herself from further harm had come crumbling down, and Sebastian couldn't help but feel responsible for that. His interrogation had torn at her carefully stitched together layers, and though he had learned the truth, he was left with the unsettling feeling that he had only scraped the surface of what Emma was truly carrying. For a brief moment, Sebastian considered apologizing, an admission that he had overstepped, that he should have never pushed her to reveal something so painful. But the words stuck in his throat, swallowed by the guilt and shame that he had long avoided acknowledging. His own grief over losing his wife suddenly felt less isolated, as though it were connected to Emma's suffering in ways he had never expected. The rawness of her emotions mirrored his own in ways he hadn't realized, and that realization left him breathless. He wasn't sure if it was empathy or something deeper that stirred within him, but he suddenly felt the weight of her loss as if it were his own. But even as his perspective shifted, he saw Emma withdraw, pulling back from the vulnerable space she had just opened. She avoided his gaze, her face closing off as the tension between them thickened. Sebastian knew that he had unintentionally hurt her, but he couldn't quite find the words to offer her the comfort she needed. Instead, he watched as she retreated into herself, retreating into a solitude that reminded him all too much of his own isolation. It was clear that Emma felt more exposed than ever. The revelation of her past, once kept so carefully hidden, had left her shaken, unsure of her place in Sebastian's life and in the household. The fear of being judged or cast aside hung in the air between them, an unspoken tension that seemed to distance them even further. She had entrusted him with the truth, but now, as the silence stretched between them, it felt like a betrayal. Sebastian's inability to offer comfort only deepened the rift that had already started to form. Emma's withdrawal didn't go unnoticed by Lucas. The young boy, who had flourished under her care, now sensed the tension that simmered between the adults. He watched the way Emma pulled away, the quiet sadness that replaced the warmth in her eyes, and it made him uneasy. The bond he had formed with her, once solid and comforting, now felt fragile, and it left him confused. He didn't understand why things had changed so suddenly, why the woman who had made him laugh and helped him through his hardest days was now retreating into herself. Lucas didn't have the words to describe his feelings, but his actions spoke volumes. He became quieter, more withdrawn, mirroring the emotional distance he saw between his father and Emma. The shift in the household was palpable. What had once been a space filled with the faint echo of laughter and warmth now felt colder, more distant. The air in the mansion, once thick with silence, had grown heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Every glance between Sebastian and Emma seemed loaded with meaning, and every silence between them felt like a chasm that neither knew how to bridge. The home that had been slowly coming alive under Emma's influence now seemed to retreat into its former lifeless state. Lucas's confusion and unease were not the only casualties of the unraveling dynamic. Sebastian, too, felt the weight of it. He had spent years burying his emotions, pretending that everything could be controlled and fixed with money and power. But now, in the face of Emma's vulnerability, he found himself questioning the very foundations of his existence. The mask he wore so easily had begun to crack, and he wasn't sure what would happen once it shattered entirely. But despite the emotional turmoil, something shifted in the air, something fragile yet undeniable. The tension between Sebastian and Emma was reaching its breaking point, and the question now was whether they would retreat further into their respective emotional fortresses or confront the fears that had kept them both locked in place for so long. The past and present were colliding, and the outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their journey was far from over. The path ahead was fraught with pain and uncertainty, but also the possibility of something transformative. The future was waiting, but they would have to face their own darkness first. Sebastian found himself in the quiet, dimly lit solitude of his study, late at night, unable to shake the weight of Emma's words. The truth of her painful past hung over him like a shadow, and he was haunted by the realization that his own life, though filled with wealth and achievement, was starkly empty. As he sat in the silence, his mind wandered back to the moments he had spent with Lucas, his son, whose needs he had ignored, whose pain he had dismissed as a nuisance. The more he reflected, the more he recognized his own failures. His obsession with control and power, his relentless drive for success, had created an insurmountable distance between him and the people he should have cared for the most. Memories of his late wife crept in, amplifying the guilt he felt. He had been so consumed with building his empire that he had neglected the most important relationships in his life. And now, As Emma's vulnerability unraveled before him, he saw just how far he had fallen. Her courage to face her own past, despite everything, made him question why he had always been so terrified of his emotions. He had been so scared of facing the raw pain of losing his wife that he buried himself in work, in control, in things that would never fill the emptiness within him. He was realizing that in running from his grief, he had also run from everything that truly mattered. In those long, silent nights, as the weight of his realizations settled deeper into his bones, Sebastian made a decision. He would change. For the first time, he was ready to let go of the mechanisms that had built his life, the ones that kept everyone at arm's length. His new focus would be not on wealth or power, but on the relationships he had neglected, the ones he had let slip away. The most pressing of these was his role as a father to Lucas, a role he had failed miserably. But there was another cause, one that had become just as important to him: Emma's fight for custody of Noah. Her pain, her desperation to reconnect with her son, had sparked something in Sebastian that he could no longer ignore. With a sense of purpose, he made calls, mobilized resources, and contacted a team of skilled lawyers and investigators. He would use his vast wealth and influence to help Emma regain custody of her son. The decision felt monumental, the first true step toward redemption in his life. It marked a dramatic shift in his character, one that would no longer be dictated by pragmatism or control, but by empathy and justice. Sebastian Cole, the ruthless businessman, was gone, replaced by a man who had finally begun to see the value in human connection. When Sebastian shared his decision with Emma, she was initially taken aback. She had spent so long shielding herself from the world, from offers of help that had always come with strings attached, that she couldn't fully process his words at first. She didn't trust him, not entirely, not yet. Her instincts, shaped by years of betrayal and heartbreak, screamed at her to be cautious. Was this gesture just another form of control, a way for him to manipulate her into a position where he held all the power? She questioned his motives, wondered if this was just another way for him to keep her in his grasp. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity. She didn't know whether it was because he truly cared or because he felt guilty, but his commitment was palpable. Despite the doubts that gnawed at her, Emma couldn't deny the possibility that this could be the breakthrough she had been hoping for. It was terrifying, yet exhilarating to consider. So, she took a step back and allowed herself the space to think, to weigh the offer against her deep-seated fears. Eventually, her hesitation gave way to hope. Cautious, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. She accepted his help, a tentative leap of faith into a future that now felt uncertain, but also full of possibilities. Lucas had been a quiet observer of the subtle shifts taking place in his home. He had always been sensitive to the changes in the atmosphere, to the way his father and Emma interacted. And now he saw something different. His father, who had been distant and detached for as long as Lucas could remember, was making an effort. He joined them for dinner, a rare act of inclusion. He listened when Lucas spoke, his attention no longer focused solely on work, but on the boy sitting across from him. These small, seemingly insignificant gestures marked a profound change. Lucas couldn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew something was different. The tension that had once hung heavily in the air was beginning to lift, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt the stirrings of something like trust. His father, the man who had always been an enigma to him, was really trying to be present. The bond between them, fragile as it was, began to grow. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for Lucas, that was enough. As Sebastian and Emma worked together on the custody case, something unexpected began to develop between them. At first, their interactions had been strictly professional, focused on the task at hand. But as they spent more time together, the emotional barriers they had both erected began to crumble. They shared stories of their respective losses, Emma speaking of Noah and Sebastian speaking of his wife. These conversations, though painful, were also healing. They revealed the depth of each other's pain, and in doing so, they created a bond built on mutual understanding. Sebastian started to see Emma not just as a woman he was helping, but as someone with incredible strength and resilience, someone he admired deeply. Emma, in turn, began to glimpse the vulnerability beneath Sebastian's hardened exterior. The man who had seemed so impervious to emotion was, in fact, someone who had suffered just as deeply as she had, but had never allowed himself the freedom to heal. Their connection deepened, not out of pity or obligation, but out of a shared understanding of the emotional wounds they both carried. It was tentative at first, fragile and uncertain, but it was the beginning of something more, something that neither of them had expected but both needed. Emma slowly began to trust Sebastian's intentions, her guard lowering bit by bit. The wounds she had carried for so long, the loss of Noah, the battle for custody, the years of silence and pain, were still fresh, but they no longer felt like an insurmountable wall. With Sebastian's support, Emma allowed herself to believe that she might actually have a chance to reunite with her son. She shared her dreams with him, not just of the legal victory they were working toward, but of the life she envisioned for Noah, the chance to be the mother she had always wanted to be. Her hope, once so buried under layers of fear and doubt, began to resurface in small but significant ways. Sebastian, too, was opening up in ways he had never done before. He revealed to Emma his own fears, his vulnerabilities, particularly his fear of failing as a father. He had been so absorbed in his work that he had neglected the most important relationship in his life, his bond with Lucas. But now, as he worked beside Emma, as he saw the depth of her pain and the strength with which she carried it, he began to re-examine his own approach to fatherhood. There were moments when he questioned if he was too late to make a difference, too far removed from Lucas's emotional needs to ever be the father his son deserved. Yet, as he watched Lucas respond to his small gestures, joining him for dinner, offering him the simplest acts of attention, he realized that it wasn't too late to try to rebuild the trust they had both lost. Lucas's transformation was equally significant. The once sullen and withdrawn child had begun to bloom, his laughter and energy returning with each passing day. He no longer felt the weight of his father's emotional neglect bearing down on him. He had witnessed a change in Sebastian, and it gave him hope that his father could be the man he needed him to be. He also saw the closeness between Emma and Sebastian, the quiet moments they shared, and it made him believe that family, real family, the kind built on love and trust, was still possible. In one particularly poignant moment, Lucas drew a picture of the three of them, his sketch simple yet powerful, a family united, smiling, together. The drawing was a small act, but for both Emma and Sebastian, it held an immense amount of significance. It was a symbol of everything they had worked for, a tangible representation of the hope they were building together. The small, everyday moments they now shared, moments filled with tenderness and understanding, became the foundation of a new life for them all. Sebastian, once a man defined by his need for control, had found a different path, one guided by empathy, love, and connection. He no longer saw himself as the detached, driven businessman, but as a father, a partner, and a man capable of genuine emotional growth. His transformation, though still in its early stages, was evident to everyone around him. The house, once cold and devoid of warmth, now felt different. The silence that had once echoed through its halls was filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and love. Emma, too, was undergoing a transformation. Though the scars of her past would never fully fade, she had found a sense of peace and purpose she hadn't known in years. Her hope for Noah's return had been rekindled, and with Sebastian by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. The support she had always longed for, the understanding she had craved, was finally here. She no longer had to carry her burdens alone. As she worked alongside Sebastian, she realized that the past didn't have to define her future. Together, they had the power to rewrite their stories, to build a future grounded in the love and trust they had cultivated. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope. Emma's fight for Noah's custody was far from over, but with Sebastian's support, she had the chance to rebuild her family. Lucas, too, was healing, his emotional scars slowly fading as he witnessed the transformation of both his father and the woman who had become a surrogate mother to him. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a burden to bear, but an opportunity to embrace. Sebastian, as he looked at the life he was beginning to build, understood that the true power in life wasn't found in wealth or control, but in the people you loved and the connections you forged. He had spent so much of his life running from the things that truly mattered, but now he saw that the only way forward was through vulnerability, through opening his heart to the ones he cared about. He wasn't the same man who had first hired Emma, a man defined by his need to dominate and control. He was learning, slowly but surely, to be the father and partner he had never allowed himself to be. And in doing so, he was giving his family, both old and new, the chance to heal and grow. As Sebastian and Emma sat together one evening, reflecting on all they had accomplished, they both knew that their journey was far from over. The legal battle for Noah was still ahead of them, and there would be more challenges, more obstacles to face. But they were no longer afraid. They had learned to trust each other, to support one another in ways that had once seemed impossible. And as they looked toward the future, they shared a quiet moment of hope, a hope that, with time and effort, they could build the family they all deserved. The final moments of their quiet evening together were filled with a sense of resolution, but also with an undeniable anticipation for what the future would bring. They both knew that while they had made significant progress, the road ahead would be filled with hurdles, legal, emotional, and personal. Emma's fight to regain custody of Noah had yet to reach its conclusion, and they were preparing for the battle that would follow. But now, there was no longer any fear in Emma's heart. The support Sebastian had shown her, the dedication he had put into helping her, gave her the courage to press on. Sebastian, too, was more resolute than ever. His determination to right the wrongs of his past, to be the father Lucas needed and the man Emma deserved, had become his new driving force. He knew that the power and control he once sought were hollow in comparison to the love and trust he was now building with Emma and Lucas. His transformation, though still unfolding, was already profound. He wasn't the cold, distant man who had once inhabited this mansion. Instead, he had become someone who understood the weight of his responsibilities, not just as a businessman, but as a father, a partner, and a man of integrity. As the days passed, their efforts to reunite Emma with Noah gained momentum. With Sebastian's resources, they secured the best legal representation, and the case slowly began to unfold in Emma's favor. The emotional toll on Emma was immense, as each step in the legal process dredged up the painful memories of her past. But she was no longer alone. Sebastian, once a man of few words, stood by her side through every twist and turn, offering unwavering support. He was learning not just to be there for her in practical terms, but emotionally as well, offering comfort when she needed it most. The breakthrough they had hoped for came when Emma's ex-husband, after months of legal wrangling, agreed to a mediated meeting. It was a pivotal moment. Emma was finally going to face the man who had caused her so much pain, who had taken her son from her in a way that had seemed unjust and permanent. She entered the meeting room with a sense of determination, but also fear. She knew that the journey ahead could go either way, and this confrontation would test everything she had built. Sebastian, ever the strategist, watched from the sidelines, but his presence was more than just logistical support. It was emotional. He knew how much this meant to Emma. He knew how much she had sacrificed to get to this point, and he was determined to be there, standing firm in her corner. His respect for her had only deepened, and his protective instincts had become undeniable. This was no longer just about legal victory. It was about protecting the woman he had come to care for deeply and ensuring that she could rebuild the family that had been taken from her. The mediation process was tense and fraught with conflict. Emma's ex-husband, though outwardly composed, was ruthless in his attempts to undermine her. But Emma, bolstered by Sebastian's unwavering presence and support, fought back with a quiet strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She no longer felt the need to hide her pain or apologize for her past mistakes. She was a mother fighting for her child, and nothing was going to stop her from reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The session dragged on for hours, but in the end, it was Emma who emerged victorious. Her ex-husband, though resistant, was forced to come to terms with the fact that he had no real claim over Noah anymore. The legal battle had taken its toll on both of them, but the resolution was one that Emma had fought for with every ounce of her being. She would have Noah back. Sebastian watched Emma's reaction to the final verdict with a mixture of pride and admiration. He had seen her at her lowest, struggling to hold on to hope, and now he saw her in her moment of triumph, her resilience fully realized. There was a shift in their relationship that day, something more than just gratitude. It was respect. Respect for the woman who had fought for her son, for her dignity, and for her future. And as they stood together in the aftermath of the battle, Emma's victory was not just hers alone, it was theirs. In the days that followed, the mansion felt different. There was an energy in the house, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. Lucas, who had been quietly observing everything unfold, could feel it too. His family, his real family, was beginning to come together. He could see the change in his father, the man who had once been an enigma, distant and unemotional, now reaching out to him, offering his love in ways that were both subtle and profound. And Emma, the woman who had come into their lives as a stranger, had become a mother to him. She had healed him, in a way, and helped him heal his father, too. Sebastian's redemption, as painful as it had been, had come full circle. His understanding of love and family had deepened in ways he could never have anticipated. He had started this journey as a man driven by control, but he had learned that true power came from love, love for his son, love for Emma, and the understanding that life was about connection, not domination. The man who had once been the master of his empire was now, in many ways, a servant to his family, committed to their well-being, to their healing, and to building a future that none of them had dared to dream of before. The journey to this point had been fraught with challenges and heartache, but it had also been marked by moments of profound change and growth. The family that had once been fractured, broken by loss and neglect, was beginning to take shape again. And in the quiet moments, as Emma and Sebastian shared looks of understanding, as Lucas smiled with the innocence of a child finally secure in his place, they all knew that the future was no longer uncertain. They had found each other, and together, they would face whatever came next with strength, hope, and love. The day Emma walked into the courtroom, the weight of the past few years seemed to hang heavier than ever. Her heart pounded in her chest as she faced her ex-husband, whose smug presence in the courtroom reminded her of the years she spent under his manipulative thumb. He wasted no time, painting a picture of her as unfit to be a mother, using their past struggles and her attempts to rebuild her life as ammunition against her. The words he spoke felt like daggers, each one trying to tear down the love she had fought so hard to preserve for her son. Yet, as she sat there, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill, she remembered why she was there. She was fighting for Noah. No matter how much it hurt, she couldn't back down now. Sebastian's support in the courtroom was steadfast, his presence like a rock by her side. He had traded in his cold, corporate demeanor for something softer and more empathetic. Every time she glanced toward him, his steady gaze reminded her that she wasn't alone. His financial backing was crucial, but it was his moral support that truly made the difference. Emma had seen him as a man of power, distant and closed off, but now, as he stood in the courtroom with her, she saw a man who cared deeply, not just for her, but for what was right. His transformation from a businessman obsessed with control to a man who understood the value of love and family was evident in every action he took. His presence, as much as the legal strategy, gave Emma the strength to keep going. Then, in a moment that surprised everyone in the room, Lucas stood. His voice, though soft and shaky, was filled with conviction as he shared his truth. He spoke of how Emma had brought warmth and love into his life, how she had been the mother figure he had longed for. He described the bond they had formed, the laughter that now filled the house, and how she deserved a chance to reunite with her son. His words cut through the tension in the room like a breath of fresh air, and even the most hardened individuals present could not deny the sincerity of his testimony. The courtroom fell silent, and for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. Outside the courtroom, Sebastian had a tense and deeply personal confrontation with Emma's ex-husband. The man, who had once controlled Emma's life, now stood exposed, his manipulative tactics failing in the face of Sebastian's raw honesty. The exchange was heated, but it marked a turning point. Sebastian defended Emma with a fierce protectiveness that made it clear he was no longer just a businessman. He was someone who deeply cared about the people in his life. This was no longer about Emma's past or her ex-husband's power. It was about doing what was right. The confrontation shook Emma's ex-husband, but it also opened Sebastian's eyes to the depths of his own character, making him realize that true strength came from standing up for others, especially when the stakes were so high. Later, in a quiet moment between father and son, Sebastian did something that no one had expected. He apologized to Lucas for his past neglect. His voice, thick with emotion, admitted his failures, vowing to be the father Lucas deserved from now on. The walls that had once separated them began to crumble as Lucas looked up at his father with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. This was the moment they had both needed, the moment where their fractured relationship began to heal. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. For the first time, Sebastian felt the weight of fatherhood, not as an obligation, but as a privilege. And Lucas could feel the sincerity in his father's words. It was the start of something new, something real. As the days passed, the courtroom drama reached its peak. The judge, after weeks of testimony, deliberated on Emma's case, and the tension in the room was palpable. When the verdict came down, Emma's heart soared with an overwhelming rush of emotion. The judge ruled in her favor, granting her custody of Noah. The tears that streamed down Emma's face were a mix of relief, joy, and years of pain finally released. After everything she had been through, after all the heartache, the setbacks, and the battles, it was finally over. She had won. She could finally bring her son home, where he belonged. Sebastian, standing off to the side, watched Emma in that moment. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so full of emotion, and it moved him deeply. There was no pride in him for himself, only for Emma. He had helped her achieve this victory, but it was her strength, her persistence, and her unwavering love for Noah that had made it possible. Sebastian had been there, yes, but Emma had carried the weight of the battle. Watching her in that moment was a bittersweet reflection of everything he had learned about love, sacrifice, and what it meant to truly care for someone. The reunion between Emma and Noah was everything Emma had imagined and more. When she finally held him in her arms, the years of separation, the fear of never being able to hold him again, melted away. It was as though the past no longer existed, and the only thing that mattered was the here and now, the love they shared and the future they would build together. Noah's small hands clutched at her, his face wet with tears, as if he, too, knew that this was the beginning of something new. Lucas, standing a few feet away, watched the reunion with quiet awe. For him, this wasn't just a victory for Emma. It was a victory for love, for family, and for the possibility of healing. He had watched Emma fight for Noah, had seen the sacrifices she had made, and now he was witnessing the culmination of that fight, a reunion that would change all of their lives forever. As Emma held Noah close, Sebastian couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace settle over him. Watching the reunion unfold before him, he saw the importance of human connection, the very thing he had spent so many years pushing away in favor of control and distance. But now he understood. It wasn't about the money, the power, or the business. It was about the people you loved and the relationships you built. The joy in Emma's face, the way Noah clung to her, the tenderness in Lucas's smile. These were the things that mattered. These were the things that made life worth living. Noah's arrival at the mansion marked the beginning of a new chapter for the family. The cold, lifeless walls that had once echoed with silence now rang with the sounds of laughter. Lucas, who had been unsure of what to expect, welcomed Noah with open arms. The bond between the two boys was instant, and soon, their days were filled with play and shared adventures. The mansion, once a place of isolation, began to feel like a home, filled with warmth, love, and the kind of joy that only family could bring. In a quiet moment, Emma turned to Sebastian, her heart full of gratitude. She thanked him for everything he had done, the legal support, the emotional support, and the way he had helped her get Noah back. Without him, she knew, this day would not have been possible. It was more than just a thank you. It was a recognition of the man Sebastian had become. He had stood by her, not just as a supporter, but as someone who truly cared. And for that, she was forever grateful. Sebastian, moved by her words, found himself at a loss for how to express his feelings. He had never been one for grand gestures or declarations of love. But in that moment, with Emma's gratitude in the air, he realized that his heart had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had come to care for Emma in ways he hadn't expected. And as he looked at her, at the woman who had shown him the true meaning of love and vulnerability, he knew that he couldn't let this moment pass without saying what was in his heart. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. "You've changed me, Emma. I didn't know how much I needed this. How much I needed you." Emma hesitated for a moment, her heart uncertain. She had been hurt so many times before, and the thought of opening herself up again filled her with fear. But as she looked at Sebastian, at the man who had stood by her through every trial, every heartbreak, she realized that he had changed. He had learned to embrace love, to show vulnerability, and to put others before himself. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to admit the truth. "I've come to care for you too, Sebastian," she said softly. "More than I ever thought possible." And in that moment, everything changed. Their connection, once tentative and cautious, blossomed into something real and full of promise. With Noah and Lucas at their side, they stood together, ready to face the future. They had fought for this moment, for love, for family, for healing, and now, as a united front, they would walk hand in hand into the future, whatever it may hold. The journey had been long and hard, but the promise of tomorrow was brighter than anything they had ever imagined. As the family stood together, their hands intertwined, a quiet sense of peace settled over the mansion. The once cold, empty halls now echoed with laughter, the sound of children playing, and the warmth of shared meals. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Emma, Noah, Sebastian, and Lucas had all been through so much, each of them carrying their own burdens. But together they had found something stronger than what any of them had expected, a sense of belonging, of connection, and a deep love that had slowly but surely woven them together. Noah and Lucas, once strangers to each other, had quickly formed a bond that was almost effortless. Their shared moments, whether in the garden, over meals, or during quiet evenings together, filled the house with an energy it had never known before. Sebastian watched them with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He had started this journey with one intention: to maintain control, to fix things. But now he understood that the true fix had come from allowing himself to be vulnerable, from learning how to be there for those he loved in ways he had never allowed himself before. Sebastian, with Emma by his side, had found a deeper sense of purpose. The same man who had once prided himself on his ability to stand alone now understood the value of family and love. He looked at Emma, his heart swelling with affection for her, knowing that she had helped him see the world in a new light. Their journey together had not been easy, but it had been worth every moment. There were still fears, of course, still doubts about what the future might hold, but in that moment, they had each other, and that was enough. Emma, for her part, felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had fought for so long, against insurmountable odds, to bring her son back into her life. The court battle, the pain of the past, the uncertainty of whether she would ever find happiness again. It had all led to this moment. She had her son, her family, and a partner who had shown her kindness and love when she least expected it. Sebastian had not only helped her win her custody case, but he had helped her believe in herself again. For that, she was more grateful than she could put into words. Lucas, now surrounded by his family, finally felt like he had the emotional security he had craved. His father's apology, though long overdue, had healed a wound that had festered for years. Watching his father embrace love, showing vulnerability and care, had shifted something deep inside him. He had learned that it was okay to feel, to trust, and to love without fear. He had learned what family meant, not just as a label, but as a bond that could withstand any storm. The mansion, which had once seemed like a cold, lonely place, now felt like a true home. Emma, Noah, Sebastian, and Lucas were more than just residents of the same house. They were a family, bound together by love, respect, and the promise of a future they would build together. The days ahead would not be without challenges, but now they had each other to face them. The road to healing had been long and difficult, but they had walked it together, each step bringing them closer to the future they dreamed of. In the quiet moments, when they were all gathered around the dinner table or sitting in the living room, it was easy to forget how far they had come. The struggles of the past, the pain of the battles fought, were now distant memories, overshadowed by the warmth of their new life together. They had healed, not just individually, but as a unit. And as they looked ahead, the horizon was full of possibilities. They were no longer defined by their pasts. They were defined by the love they had for each other and the shared commitment to moving forward. Sebastian, who had once thought he was incapable of love, now knew that he had so much to give. He had been given a second chance, not just with his son, but with Emma, with Lucas, and with the life they could build together. The lessons he had learned from Emma's resilience, from Lucas's innocence, and from his own past mistakes had changed him in ways he never thought possible. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a father, a partner, a man who had finally learned the true meaning of connection. And Emma, with Noah now safely by her side, knew that the love she had fought for was finally hers. She had walked through the darkness of her past, but now she stood in the light of a future full of hope. She had her family, her son, her partner, and the man who had shown her what it meant to love and be loved. She had found peace, not just in her heart, but in the arms of those who mattered most. As they stood together in the quiet of the night, hand in hand, the promise of tomorrow stretched out before them, a future where they would face the challenges of life together, as a family, no longer bound by their past, but empowered by the love and strength they had found in each other. And so, their journey began anew, not with the weight of past mistakes or regrets, but with the promise of a future built on trust, love, and a deep connection that would carry them through whatever came next. Together, they were ready to face whatever the world had in store, their hearts full of hope, and their eyes fixed firmly on the future.